deep in the red rock canyons of southeastern Oklahoma, where ancient Choctaw spirits are said to whisper through wind-carved stone, there lived a woman who had forgotten her own name and chose to exist like a wild animal rather than face the world that had broken her. The canyon system stretched for miles through the rugged terrain where Oklahoma's rolling hills gave way to dramatic sandstone formations, creating a labyrinth of hidden passages, natural shelters, and secret water. Sources that had protected both wildlife and humans for countless generations. Most locals avoided the deeper reaches of these canyons, partly from respect for the sacred sites scattered throughout the area, and partly because the terrain was treacherous enough to claim the lives of experienced hikers who ventured too far from marked trails. But David Redwing was not most locals.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
At 42, David served as the elected chief of the Choctaw Nation's Southeastern District, a position that required him to balance traditional tribal responsibilities with modern administrative duties that often kept him tied to conference rooms and government offices in Durant. His great-grandfather had been a medicine man who knew every hidden spring and sacred cave in these canyons, and David had spent his childhood learning to read the subtle signs that revealed the landscape's secrets. The knowledge had served him well during his years as a park ranger before entering tribal politics, and he still made regular solo journeys into the wilderness to maintain his connection to the land that shaped his people's identity. These expeditions served multiple purposes, allowing him to monitor environmental conditions that affected tribal lands, check on archaeological sites that required protection, and find the spiritual renewal that came from walking the same paths his ancestors had traveled for over 1,000 years. On this particular October morning, David was following a game trail that wound deep into Canyon de los Muertos, a formation named by Spanish explorers but known to the Choctaw as Ocafalea, the long water, for the permanent spring that had sustained life in this harsh environment since time immemorial. He was investigating reports from tribal game wardens about unusual animal behavior in the area, specifically the displacement of deer and small mammals that suggested either a large predator or human activity in areas that should have been uninhabited. The first sign of human presence was subtle enough that most people would have missed it entirely. A piece of fabric caught on a thorny bush, bleached by sun and weather but clearly manufactured rather than natural. David examined the material carefully, noting that it appeared to be cotton denim, probably from women's clothing based on the weave and color. The placement suggested someone had passed through the area recently enough that the fabric hadn't completely deteriorated, but long enough ago that it had been exposed to multiple weather cycles. Further along the trail, David discovered more evidence of human activity. Stones that had been moved from their natural positions to create stepping places across seasonal water channels. Branches broken in patterns that suggested someone had been clearing passage through dense undergrowth. Most telling of all, the subtle signs of a path that had been used repeatedly, worn just enough to be visible to someone who knew how to read the landscape, but carefully concealed from casual observation. David's tracking skills had been honed by decades of experience in wilderness environments, from his childhood lessons with tribal elders to his professional training as a park ranger to his ongoing responsibilities for monitoring tribal lands. He could distinguish between the tracks of different animals, recognize the age of disturbed vegetation, and identify human sign, even when someone was making deliberate efforts to avoid detection. The evidence he was finding told a story of long-term habitation by someone who possessed surprisingly sophisticated knowledge of wilderness survival. The trail led deeper into the canyon system, following routes that took advantage of natural shelter and water sources while avoiding areas that would be visible from the main hiking trails or accessible to casual visitors. Whoever had created this path understood the landscape intimately and had chosen routes that demonstrated both practical survival skills and cultural knowledge, of how indigenous peoples had historically used these canyons. As David followed the increasingly clear signs of human presence, he began to piece together a profile of someone who had been living in these canyons for an extended period. The evidence suggested a single individual, probably female based on the clothing fragment, and the size of occasional footprints he found in muddy areas near water sources. The survival techniques being employed showed knowledge that went beyond basic camping skills, indicating either extensive wilderness training or desperate necessity that had forced rapid learning. The breakthrough came when David discovered a carefully concealed cache of supplies hidden in a natural rock formation about 3 miles from the nearest established trail. The cache contained items that revealed both the sophistication and desperation of whoever had created it. Hand-forged tools made from scavenged metal, containers fashioned from discarded plastic bottles and aluminum cans, and a collection of medicinal plants that had been harvested and dried using traditional methods that few people outside indigenous communities would know. More intriguingly, the cache showed evidence of ongoing use. Food items that couldn't have been stored for more than a few weeks, freshly gathered plant materials, and signs that the hiding place had been accessed within the past few days. David was getting close to finding someone who had been successfully hiding in these canyons for what appeared to be months or possibly years. The final piece of evidence that convinced David he was dealing with a long-term inhabitant rather than a temporary visitor came when he discovered a network of rain catchment systems that had been created using natural rock formations and improvised materials. The systems demonstrated engineering knowledge and planning that would only make sense for someone who intended to survive in this location indefinitely. More importantly, they showed cultural understanding of how water moved through the canyon system during different seasons, knowledge that usually took years to develop. David made the decision to approach the situation with the same care and respect he would use when dealing with any potentially dangerous wildlife encounter. Someone who had chosen such extreme isolation and demonstrated such sophisticated survival skills was probably either running from something terrible or protecting something precious. Either way, a direct confrontation could be catastrophic for everyone involved. The cave that served as the primary shelter was located in a section of the canyon that David had explored as a child but hadn't visited in over a decade. It was positioned about 40 feet up a steep rock face, accessible only by a treacherous climb that would be impossible for anyone not in excellent physical condition. The entrance was partially concealed by a natural rock formation that made it invisible from most angles, and the approach routes had been carefully camouflaged to avoid detection. From his position on the canyon floor, David could see clear evidence of long-term habitation. Smoke stains on the rocks above the cave entrance indicated regular fires, though whoever lived there was careful to burn only dry wood that produced minimal smoke. A series of rope and pulley systems had been rigged to transport water and supplies up the cliff face, demonstrating both mechanical knowledge and access to materials that suggested contact with the outside world. Most remarkably, the area around the cave showed signs of environmental stewardship that impressed David with its sophistication. Erosion control measures had been implemented to prevent storm damage. Native plants had been cultivated to provide both food and camouflage, and waste disposal systems had been created that followed traditional ecological principles he recognized from tribal teachings about living in harmony with the land. David called out in both English and Choctaw, using the respectful forms of address that his grandfather had taught him for approaching unknown persons in sacred spaces. His voice echoed through the canyon, bouncing off stone walls in ways that made it impossible for whoever was in the cave to determine his exact location or numbers. The response was immediate and telling, a subtle shift in the patterns of birds and small animals that indicated human movement above. Someone listening and trying to decide whether to respond or remain hidden. The silence that followed David's greeting stretched for several minutes. broken only by the natural sounds of wind through stone and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
David remained motionless, demonstrating through body language that he posed no immediate threat, while making it clear that he was aware of the cave's occupant and was prepared to wait for a response. When the voice finally came from above, it was barely audible, weakened by disuse, and heavy with the kind of caution that came from months or years of avoiding human contact. The single word spoken was "please," delivered with such desperate vulnerability that David felt his chest tighten with recognition of someone who had been pushed far beyond the normal limits of human endurance. David responded in the same quiet tone, speaking slowly and clearly to ensure his words would carry up the cliff face, without seeming threatening or demanding. He identified himself by name and tribal affiliation, explained that he was alone and unarmed, and offered assurance that he had no intention of forcing anyone to leave their chosen shelter or reveal information they preferred to keep private. The conversation that followed was halting and careful, conducted across 40 feet of vertical distance between two people who were both acutely aware that the interaction could change everything about the isolated existence that had been established in the cave. David learned that his instincts had been correct about the gender and approximate age of the cave's inhabitant, and that she possessed knowledge of both survival techniques and local geography that suggested either extensive training or desperate necessity. More importantly, David's experienced ear detected signs of trauma in the woman's voice that went far beyond the normal stress of wilderness survival. The careful modulation of tone, the long pauses before responding to questions, and the obvious effort required to engage in even basic conversation suggested someone who had been systematically damaged by human interaction and was struggling to remember how to trust another person's intentions. The breakthrough came when David began speaking in Choctaw about the traditional uses of the canyon system, sharing stories his grandfather had told him about how their people had used these caves during times of conflict and displacement. The woman's responses indicated she had been learning about local indigenous history and survival techniques, not from books or academic sources, but from careful observation and experimentation that showed genuine respect for traditional knowledge. David realized that he was dealing with someone who had not only survived in one of the most challenging environments in Oklahoma, but had done so while learning and applying cultural practices that connected her to the historical experience of his own people. The recognition created an unexpected sense of kinship that transcended the obvious differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. As the afternoon progressed and shadows began to lengthen across the canyon floor, David made a decision that would prove crucial for both of their futures. Instead of pressing for more information or trying to convince the woman to abandon her cave, he offered to leave supplies and return periodically to check on her welfare. The offer was made without conditions or expectations, presented as a simple act of human kindness that honored her choice to remain isolated while acknowledging her basic need for support. The response from above was another single word, "Why?" spoken with the kind of bewilderment that came from someone who had lost faith in the possibility of unconditional kindness. David's answer drew on both his personal experience and his cultural understanding of community responsibility, explaining that helping others was not a transaction that required justification, but a fundamental obligation that connected all people to the web of relationships that made survival possible. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls by the time David began his journey back to his truck, leaving behind a carefully arranged collection of supplies that included food, water, medical items, and materials for maintaining the cave's infrastructure. More importantly, he left behind a commitment to return regularly and a promise that the woman's location and circumstances would remain confidential unless she explicitly requested help that required involving other people. The drive back Tidorant gave David time to process the implications of what he had discovered. Someone with obvious intelligence and survival skills had chosen to live in conditions that most people would consider desperate, suggesting that whatever she was hiding from was worse than the daily challenges of cave dwelling in the Oklahoma wilderness. The responsibility he had accepted by offering help was significant, involving not just practical support, but the kind of patient relationship building that could take months or years to develop. That night, as David reviewed tribal records and historical documents about the canyon system, he began to understand that he had encountered something unprecedented in his experience as both a tribal leader and a wilderness professional. The woman in the cave had created a sustainable lifestyle that honored traditional indigenous survival techniques while maintaining complete independence from modern social systems. The achievement was remarkable, but the desperation that had driven it suggested trauma that would require careful and respectful healing. David's last thought before falling asleep was a recognition that his role in this situation would extend far beyond simple humanitarian assistance. He had been placed in a position to help someone reclaim their connection to human community, a responsibility that connected directly to his understanding of traditional Choctaw values about mutual support and collective healing. The woman in the cave had survived alone, but true recovery would require rebuilding the trust in human relationships that had obviously been shattered by whatever had driven her to such extreme isolation. The mystery of who she was and what had brought her to the canyon would unfold gradually, but David understood instinctively that the more important question was not about her past, but about the future they might be able to create together. The ancient stones of Canyon de los Muertos had sheltered his people during their darkest hours, and now they were providing the same sanctuary for someone who needed time to heal before rejoining the world of human community. Over the following weeks, David established a routine that balanced his official duties as tribal chief with his personal commitment to supporting the mysterious woman in the cave. Every few days, he would make the journey into the canyon system, always announcing his approach with the same respectful calls in both languages, always maintaining the careful distance that allowed for communication without creating pressure. For face-to-face interaction, the supply drops became more sophisticated as David learned about the woman's specific needs and capabilities. She had requested books about local geology and botany, materials for expanding her water collection systems, and tools that would allow her to improve the cave's infrastructure. Each request revealed more about her intelligence and practical skills, painting a picture of someone who was not merely surviving, but actively working to create a sustainable long-term lifestyle. David's professional experience had taught him to read people's needs and motivations quickly, skills that served him well in tribal politics where understanding unspoken concerns was often more important than responding to explicit requests. The woman in the cave communicated primarily through actions rather than words, and David learned to interpret the subtle changes in her supply requests and the condition of items she returned as indicators of her physical and emotional state. The most revealing discovery came when David found a collection of detailed sketches that had been left with a note requesting art supplies. The drawings showed the canyon system from perspectives that could only have been achieved through extensive exploration, rendered with an accuracy that demonstrated both artistic talent and scientific observation skills. More importantly, the sketches included details about wildlife behavior, plant growth patterns, and seasonal changes that suggested the woman had been systematically studying her environment with the dedication of a trained researcher. David recognized that he was dealing with someone whose intellectual capabilities were being channeled into survival activities that would normally require a team of specialists. The depth of knowledge she had acquired about local ecology, traditional survival techniques, and sustainable living practices represented achievements that would have been impressive under any circumstances, but were remarkable given the isolation and limited resources of her situation. The breakthrough in their relationship came during David's 5th visit to the canyon, when unseasonably heavy rains had turned the normally manageable creek into a raging torrent that made his usual approach routes impassable. David was forced to take a longer path that brought him to the base of the cliff during the height of the storm. Soaked and exhausted from fighting through flash flood conditions that had nearly swept him off his feet several times, the voice from above came without his usual greeting call, sharp with concern and surprisingly clear despite the wind and rain. The woman had been watching his approach and had seen him struggle with the dangerous crossing. Her directions for reaching a safer position were delivered with the authority of someone who had intimate knowledge of how water moved through the canyon during extreme weather events. For the first time since their initial contact, the woman spoke at length, providing detailed warnings about flood patterns, safe routes to higher ground, and the locations of emergency shelters that David could use to wait out the storm. The information revealed that she had been systematically mapping the canyon's dangerous areas and had developed contingency plans for various emergency scenarios that went far beyond her own immediate survival needs. David realized that the woman had been watching over him during his visits with the same care and attention that he had been trying to provide for her. She had been tracking his movements, assessing his safety, and developing plans to assist him if he encountered difficulties. The recognition that she had been protecting him while accepting his help created a new dynamic in their relationship based on mutual responsibility rather than one-sided assistance. The storm that had brought them together in crisis also provided the opportunity for David to demonstrate his own capabilities and trustworthiness under pressure. When a section of the cliff face collapsed near the cave entrance, blocking the woman's primary access route and threatening the stability of her water collection systems, David was able to provide both technical expertise and physical assistance. That prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of her shelter. Working together from a distance, communicating through shouted instructions and carefully coordinated movements, David and the woman managed to stabilize the damaged area and create alternative access routes that actually improved the cave's security and functionality. The collaborative effort required trust, communication, and shared problem-solving that marked a fundamental shift in their relationship from cautious coexistence to active partnership. The success of their storm response revealed capabilities that neither had been able to demonstrate individually. David's engineering knowledge and physical strength, combined with the woman's intimate understanding of the site's specific challenges and her improvised solutions, created results that exceeded what either could have achieved alone. More importantly, the shared crisis had required them to trust each other's judgment in life-threatening situations. As the storm subsided and David prepared to leave the canyon, the woman made her first direct request for information rather than supplies. She asked about David's background, his role in the tribal government, and his knowledge of legal protections that might be available to people who needed to remain hidden from mainstream society. The question suggested that she was beginning to consider possibilities beyond indefinite isolation. David's answers were carefully crafted to provide useful information without pressuring the woman to reveal details about her own situation that she wasn't ready to share. He explained tribal sovereignty laws, federal protections for people seeking refuge from domestic violence, and legal mechanisms that could provide anonymity and security for people who needed to rebuild their lives away from past threats. The conversation that followed was the longest and most substantive they had shared, covering topics that ranged from practical legal matters to philosophical questions about community, responsibility, and individual autonomy. David learned that the woman possessed sophisticated knowledge of social systems and legal frameworks, suggesting educational and professional backgrounds that contrasted sharply with her current circumstances. Most significantly, the woman began to ask questions about David's motivations for helping her, not from suspicion but from genuine curiosity, about the cultural and personal values that had led him to take responsibility for a stranger's welfare. Her questions revealed that she had been thinking deeply about the nature of human relationships and community obligations during her months of isolation. David's explanations drew heavily on traditional Choctaw teachings about the interconnectedness of all life and the responsibility that each person had to support the survival and growth of others. The concepts were not presented as religious doctrine, but as practical wisdom that had enabled his people to survive displacement, persecution, and cultural disruption while maintaining their identity and values. The woman's responses indicated that she had been searching for exactly this kind of framework for understanding human relationships, something that could help her make sense of both the cruelty that had driven her to isolation and the kindness that David was offering without expectation of return. The traditional indigenous perspective on community responsibility provided her with tools for thinking about trust and connection that her previous experiences had not supplied. As David began his journey back to Durant that evening, he carried with him the understanding that their relationship had evolved beyond emergency assistance into something that resembled the traditional mentor-student relationships that had historically connected Choctaw elders with younger community members. Seeking guidance, the woman in the cave had begun to trust not just his practical help, but his wisdom and cultural knowledge. The implications of this development extended far beyond their personal relationship. David recognized that he was being presented with an opportunity to demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional indigenous values in addressing contemporary problems of trauma, isolation, and social disconnection. The woman's recovery could become a model for how ancient wisdom could be applied to modern healing processes. The mystery of her identity and background remained unsolved, but David understood that those details were less important than the progress being made in rebuilding her capacity for human connection. The cave that had served as her refuge was gradually becoming a classroom, where she could learn to trust again while maintaining the safety and autonomy that her healing required. The ancient canyon walls had witnessed countless stories of survival and transformation over the centuries, and David felt privileged to be participating in the continuation of that tradition. The woman who had chosen to live like a frightened creature was beginning to remember what it meant to be part of a human community, and David was honored to serve as her guide back to the world of relationships and mutual support that made true healing possible. 2 years before Lily Mae Harrison made her desperate climb up the Red Canyon walls to hide in a cave like a wounded animal, she had been Dr. Lily Mae Harrison, the youngest department head in the history of Tulsa General Hospital's Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. The hospital corridors where she had once walked with confident authority were a world away from the harsh stone surfaces that now defined her existence, but the skills that had made her exceptional at saving children's lives had translated unexpectedly well to the brutal mathematics of wilderness survival. Her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, to make life or death decisions with incomplete information, and to work for days without sleep had prepared her for challenges she never could have imagined when she was fighting to keep premature babies alive in state-of-the-art medical facilities. Lily Mae's childhood in the small town of Antlers, Oklahoma, had been shaped by her grandmother's stories about their family's Cherokee heritage and her grandfather's tales of working the oil fields that had transformed southeastern Oklahoma during the early 20th century. She had grown up understanding that survival required both connection to traditional knowledge and adaptation to changing circumstances. Lessons that would prove invaluable during her years of medical training and later during her desperate flight from civilization. The path to medical school had been paved with scholarships, part-time jobs, and the kind of relentless determination that comes from being the first person in your family to pursue professional education. Lily Mae had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Oklahoma before completing her residency at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where she had distinguished herself as someone who could handle the most complex cases while maintaining the emotional resilience necessary for working with critically ill children. Her return to Oklahoma had been motivated by a desire to serve communities that lacked access to specialized pediatric care, and her position at Tulsa General had allowed her to establish programs that brought advanced medical services to rural areas throughout the state. By age 31, she had been featured in medical journals for her innovative approaches to pediatric emergency medicine and had been recruited by hospitals in Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles that could offer higher salaries and more prestigious positions. But Lily May had chosen to remain in Oklahoma, drawn by the opportunity to make a meaningful difference in communities that reminded her of her own childhood experiences with limited resources and strong family connections. Her work had earned recognition from tribal health organizations, state medical associations, and federal agencies concerned with rural healthcare access, establishing her as a rising star in her field who combined technical expertise with genuine commitment to underserved populations. The first time she met Dr. Richard Blackwood, he had been consulting on a complex case involving a 7-year-old Choctaw boy who had suffered severe injuries in a car accident. Richard was a neurosurgeon from Dallas whose reputation for handling difficult pediatric cases had brought him to Tulsa for what was expected to be a routine consultation. But the child's condition had deteriorated overnight, requiring emergency intervention that would test both doctors' skills and judgment. Working together during the 18-hour surgery that saved the boy's life, Lily May and Richard had demonstrated the kind of professional compatibility that made them highly effective as a medical team. Richard's surgical precision combined with Lily May's understanding of pediatric physiology and her knowledge of the cultural factors that would affect the family's decision-making process throughout the recovery period. Richard had been impressed not just by Lily May's technical competence, but by her ability to communicate with tribal elders, social workers, and family members in ways that built trust and cooperation during an extraordinarily stressful situation. He had watched her navigate complex cultural and medical considerations with a sophistication that few physicians possessed, and he had made it clear that he considered her one of the most talented colleagues he had ever worked with. The romantic relationship that developed over the following months had seemed like a natural extension of their professional partnership. Richard was charming, successful, and genuinely interested in Lily May's work with underserved communities. He spoke eloquently about the importance of bringing advanced medical care to rural areas, and he seemed to understand and respect her commitment to serving populations that had been historically neglected by mainstream healthcare systems. Richard's courtship had been sophisticated and thoughtful, incorporating his understanding of Lily May's professional interests and cultural background in ways that made her feel seen and appreciated for exactly who she was. He had arranged for them to attend medical conferences together, had introduced her to colleagues who could advance her career, and had consistently praised her work in ways that boosted her confidence and professional reputation. When Richard proposed after 8 months of dating, the engagement ring had been accompanied by a partnership offer from a prestigious pediatric hospital in Dallas, where Richard had arranged for Lily May to be considered for a department head position that would triple her salary and provide resources for research that could benefit rural communities throughout the Southwest. The opportunity seemed like the perfect combination of professional advancement and personal fulfillment. The engagement party had been held at Richard's family estate in Highland Park, an elegant affair attended by Dallas medical elite and political figures who spoke casually about their influence over healthcare policy and funding decisions. Lily May had felt honored to be welcomed into circles where she could potentially advocate for the communities she served, and she had been impressed by Richard's family's apparent interest in her work with indigenous populations. But during the party, Lily May had overheard a conversation between Richard and several colleagues that had planted the first seeds of doubt about his motivations and character. Richard had described her as brilliant but idealistic about the realities of medical practice, and had assured the other men that she would mature out of her fixation on charity cases once she was established in a more prestigious position. and understood the importance of building a profitable practice. The comment had stung, but Lily May had rationalized it as Richard's attempt to defend her work to colleagues who might not understand the value of serving underserved populations. She had convinced herself that his perspective would evolve as he learned more about the communities she served and the impact that accessible healthcare could have on rural families. The systematic erosion of Lily May's professional autonomy had begun gradually after their engagement became public. Richard had started involving himself in her work decisions, suggesting that certain cases were too time-consuming or emotionally draining for someone planning a wedding and preparing for a major career transition. He had expressed concern about her tendency to work long hours with difficult cases, worried about the stress she was placing on herself during what should be a happy and exciting period in their lives. When Lily May had been invited to present her research on rural pediatric emergency protocols at an international conference in Geneva, Richard's reaction had surprised her with its intensity. He had explained with apparent logic and concern why accepting the invitation would be inappropriate given her upcoming move to Dallas and the need to focus on preparing for her new position rather than pursuing projects that would distract from her primary career objectives. The arguments that followed had revealed aspects of Richard's personality that Lily May had never seen before. When she insisted that the Geneva presentation was important for advancing rural healthcare initiatives, Richard had become condescending, explaining that her emotional attachment to charity work was preventing her from making rational decisions about her professional future. He had reminded her of the opportunities he had created for her in Dallas, suggesting that her reluctance to prioritize their shared goals over her individual projects revealed immaturity and ingratitude that surprised and disappointed him. When Lily May had begun to cry during the argument, Richard had expressed concern about her emotional stability and had suggested that the stress of wedding planning might be affecting her judgment more than she realized. The pattern had continued and intensified over the following months. Richard's involvement in Lily May's professional life had become total and controlling, though always presented as supportive guidance from someone who understood the medical field better than she did. He had begun monitoring her work schedule, questioning her relationships with colleagues, and making decisions about their social calendar that effectively isolated her from the professional networks she had built over years of practice. Lily May had found herself second-guessing clinical decisions that she had once made with confidence, seeking Richard's approval for professional choices that she had previously handled independently. Her colleagues had begun to notice changes in her behavior, commenting that she seemed less decisive in medical consultations and more deferential to authority figures than they remembered from her earlier years at the hospital. The breaking point had come during a medical emergency that would haunt Lily May's dreams during her months in the canyon cave. A 5-year-old Creek girl had been brought to the emergency department after a near-drowning incident, and Lily May's initial assessment had identified complications that the attending physician had missed. Her intervention had potentially saved the child's life, but Richard's reaction had been swift and devastating. Instead of celebrating Lily May's diagnostic skills, Richard had publicly questioned her decision to override the attending physician's treatment plan, suggesting that her behavior demonstrated the kind of arrogance and poor judgment that could damage her reputation and career prospects. He had delivered this criticism in front of the child's family, hospital administrators, and medical colleagues, framing his concerns in language that sounded professional but felt deeply personal. The humiliation had been compounded by Richard's later explanation that he was trying to protect her from the consequences of her own impulsiveness, that her tendency to act on emotion rather than protocol was something that would need to be corrected before she could succeed in a more prestigious medical environment. He had suggested that her connection to the Creek family had clouded her clinical judgment, and that her identification with indigenous patients was becoming problematic for her professional development. That night, alone in her apartment while Richard attended a medical conference in Houston, Lily May had finally acknowledged what she had been trying to deny for months. She was engaged to someone who was systematically destroying her confidence, her professional relationships, and her connection to the work that had always been her passion and calling. The recognition had been followed by panic about how to escape from a situation that had become emotionally and professionally untenable. Richard was deeply connected to medical communities throughout Oklahoma and Texas. Their lives had become financially intertwined through shared investments and wedding planning, and Lily May had lost so much confidence in her own judgment that she wasn't sure she could trust her perception of what was happening to her. The final incident had occurred during a hospital board meeting where Lily May was scheduled to present her proposal for expanding pediatric services to rural communities throughout southeastern Oklahoma. Richard had attended the meeting as her fiancé and professional supporter, but his questions during the presentation had systematically undermined her research, her conclusions, and her credibility with board members who would make decisions about funding her programs. Richard's critique had been delivered with surgical precision, targeting every vulnerability in her proposal while maintaining the appearance of constructive professional feedback. He had questioned her methodology, suggested that her emotional investment in the subject matter had compromised her objectivity, and implied that her inexperience with administrative responsibilities made her unsuitable for the expanded role she was seeking. The board had voted to table her proposal pending further review, effectively ending years of work that could have brought advanced pediatric care to thousands of rural children. Lily May had watched her professional dreams crumble under the weight of criticism from the man who claimed to love and support her, delivered in front of colleagues whose respect she had spent years earning. When Richard had approached her after the meeting to offer comfort and reassurance, explaining that the board's decision was actually beneficial because it would allow her to focus on preparing for their move to Dallas without the distraction of managing complex rural healthcare programs, Lily May had realized that his sabotage had been deliberate and calculated. The recognition that Richard had systematically destroyed her work, her relationships, and her professional reputation while maintaining the facade of loving support had triggered a psychological break that sent Lily May into a dissociative state where flight seemed like the only option for survival. She had spent the night walking through Tulsa's empty streets, unable to return to the apartment she shared with Richard, unable to contact friends and colleagues who had witnessed her humiliation, unable to imagine any future that didn't involve continued psychological destruction. The idea of disappearing entirely had come to her as she sat in her car at sunrise, watching the sun rise over the Arkansas River while trying to understand how her life had been transformed from professional success and personal happiness into a nightmare of manipulation and control. The canyon country of southeastern Oklahoma, where she had spent childhood summers with her grandmother, had represented the only place she could imagine finding safety from Richard's influence. Lily May had spent 3 days gathering supplies and preparing for what she knew would be either a temporary escape that allowed her to regain her emotional balance or a permanent disappearance that would end the psychological torture she could no longer endure. She had withdrawn money carefully, created false explanations for her absence, and maintained the appearance of normal routine while planning what she understood might be a suicidal flight from everything that had defined her adult life. The night she left Tulsa, Richard had been in Dallas meeting with hospital administrators about her upcoming position, probably discussing strategies for managing her emotional instability and ensuring that her transition to his preferred version of her professional identity would proceed smoothly. Lily May had loaded her Jeep with camping equipment and survival supplies, leaving behind a note that explained only that she needed time alone to think about their relationship and her career. The drive to the canyon country had taken her through small towns and rural landscapes that reminded her of the communities she had served as a physician, places where her work had made a genuine difference in children's lives and where her cultural background had been an asset rather than a professional liability. Each mile had taken her further from Richard's sphere of influence and closer to the traditional lands, where her grandmother had taught her that survival sometimes required choosing solitude over society. The climb to the cave had been the most physically challenging thing Lily May had ever attempted, but it had also been the first decision in months that felt entirely her own, chosen without considering Richard's approval or disapproval, made purely on the basis of her own assessment of what she needed for her survival and recovery. The cave that would become her refuge had offered exactly what she needed: complete isolation from the systems that had been used to control and manipulate her, and the opportunity to rebuild her sense of self through direct interaction with challenges that provided immediate and honest feedback. The first night in the cave had nearly killed Lily May, not from exposure or lack of supplies, but from the psychological shock of complete silence after months of constant anxiety about Richard's reactions to every word she spoke, every decision she made, every breath she took. The absence of his voice, his presence, his judgment had created a vacuum so profound that Lily May had spent hours sitting at the cave entrance, listening to her own heartbeat and wondering if the sound of her breathing was too loud. If even here in this remote canyon she might somehow be detected and dragged back to the suffocating world of medical conferences and engagement parties, where she had slowly disappeared inside Richard's version of who she should become. But as dawn broke over the red canyon walls and painted the stone formations in shades of gold and crimson that she hadn't noticed in years of driving past similar landscapes, Lily May had experienced something she had almost forgotten existed: ability to make a decision based purely on her own desires rather than someone else's expectations. She had chosen to explore the cave system, not because Richard would approve or disapprove, but because she was curious about the geological formations that created these natural shelters. The cave extended much deeper into the cliff face than she had initially realized, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages that required careful navigation, but offered protection from weather and potential discovery. The main chamber where she had spent the night was approximately 12 feet wide and 8 feet high, with a natural chimney that would allow for small fires while dispersing smoke in ways that wouldn't create visible plumes. A smaller side chamber provided storage space that would remain dry even during severe storms. Lily May's medical training had included emergency field medicine, but she had never imagined applying those skills to long-term wilderness survival. Her first week in the canyon had been a crash course in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application, between treating patients in controlled hospital environments and keeping herself alive with limited resources in conditions that changed dramatically with each shift in weather patterns. The water situation had required immediate attention and creative problem-solving that drew on both her medical understanding of hydration needs and her childhood memories of her grandfather's stories about finding reliable water sources in harsh environments. The canyon had several seasonal springs, but only one that flowed year-round, located about a quarter-mile from the cave and accessible only by climbing down treacherous rock faces that became deadly slippery during rain. Lily May had engineered a water collection and transportation system using plastic containers she had brought as part of her camping supplies, supplemented by materials she found scattered throughout the canyon from previous visitors or washed down from higher elevations during flash floods. The system had evolved over weeks of experimentation and failure, each improvement teaching her more about the physics of water movement and the engineering challenges of creating sustainable infrastructure with improvised materials. Food had presented even more complex challenges that forced Lily May to confront the vast difference between intellectual knowledge and survival-level competence. She had read about edible plants and traditional hunting techniques, but identifying safe food sources in the field required skills that could only be developed through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the kind of mistakes that could be fatal if not managed properly. The learning process had been brutal and methodical, combining her scientific training with desperate necessity in ways that produced genuine expertise through trial and error that left no room for theoretical speculation. Lily May had made herself violently ill with misidentified mushrooms, had spent days weak from hunger after failed attempts at hunting small game, and had learned to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished edible plants from their toxic lookalikes through observations that were literally matters of life and death. But gradually, she had developed a sophisticated understanding of the canyon's ecosystem that allowed her to harvest food sources sustainably while maintaining the delicate balance that kept wildlife populations stable and plant communities healthy. Her medical knowledge of nutrition and her scientific approach to problem-solving had enabled her to create meal plans that met her physiological needs while working within the constraints of seasonal availability and limited preparation methods. The physical transformation had been dramatic and painful, reshaping her body in ways that reflected the fundamental changes in how she spent her days and what skills she needed for survival. The soft hands that had once performed delicate surgical procedures became calloused and scarred from handling rough stone and improvised tools. The slender frame that had been maintained through gym memberships and careful meal planning had developed lean muscle mass from constant climbing, carrying, and manual labor. More challenging than the physical adaptations had been the psychological adjustments required for living without the structured social interactions that had defined her professional identity. Lily May had spent months learning to trust her own judgment without seeking validation from colleagues, to make decisions without considering how they would be perceived by supervisors or peers, and to find satisfaction in accomplishments that no one else would witness or acknowledge. The silence had been the most difficult aspect of canyon life to master, not the absence of human voices but the complete elimination of the constant internal dialogue that had developed during her relationship with Richard. For months she had conducted imaginary conversations with him, explaining and defending her choices, anticipating his criticisms, and rehearsing responses to arguments that would never happen. Learning to quiet that mental noise had required conscious effort and meditation techniques that she developed through pure necessity. The seasons had become her calendar and her teacher, marking time through changes in weather patterns, animal behavior, and plant growth cycles that created natural rhythms for her daily activities. Spring had brought renewed plant growth and returning wildlife, but also dangerous flash floods that could transform peaceful canyon streams into deadly torrents within minutes. Summer had provided abundant food sources and comfortable living conditions, but also extreme heat that made certain activities impossible during daylight hours. Autumn had required intensive preparation for winter survival, gathering and preserving food sources, weatherproofing the cave, and creating heating systems that would sustain her through months, when leaving the shelter might be impossible for days at a time. Winter had tested every system she had created and every skill she had developed, forcing her to survive on stored resources while maintaining the cave's infrastructure under conditions that challenged her physical and mental endurance. Each seasonal cycle had taught Lily May more about the complex relationships between weather patterns, ecological systems, and the practical requirements for human survival in environments that offered both abundant resources and constant dangers. She had learned to read cloud formations and wind patterns to predict storms hours before they arrived, to identify animal behaviors that indicated changes in food availability or the presence of predators, and to manage her energy and resources according to natural cycles rather than artificial schedules. The most profound transformation had been in Lily May's relationship with fear and uncertainty, emotions that had dominated her life during the final months with Richard but had taken on completely different meanings in the context of wilderness survival. Fear of physical danger had become a useful tool for assessing real risks and making appropriate safety decisions, while fear of social judgment had gradually disappeared as irrelevant to her immediate needs and long-term survival. Uncertainty about weather, food availability, and seasonal changes had become simply another set of variables to monitor and plan for, rather than sources of anxiety that paralyzed decision-making. Lily May had learned to live comfortably with incomplete information and unpredictable circumstances, developing contingency plans and backup systems that allowed her to adapt quickly to changing conditions without losing confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges arose. The development of practical skills had been accompanied by a gradual rebuilding of self-confidence that had been systematically destroyed during her relationship with Richard. Every successful repair to the cave's infrastructure, every meal harvested from wild plants, every storm weathered safely had provided concrete evidence of her competence and judgment. The feedback from her environment had been immediate and honest, rewarding good decisions with improved living conditions and punishing mistakes with discomfort or danger that taught valuable lessons. By her second winter in the canyon, Lily May had achieved a level of self-sufficiency that would have seemed impossible during her years as a hospital physician dependent on complex technological systems and large support staffs. She had learned to manufacture tools from scavenged materials, to preserve food using techniques that required no refrigeration or commercial preservatives, and to maintain her health using medicinal plants and natural remedies that she had tested carefully through systematic experimentation. The medical emergency that had tested all of her survival skills had occurred during a late spring storm that had trapped her in the cave for nearly a week while flash floods made movement through the canyon system impossible. A badly infected cut on her hand, caused by a slip while gathering firewood, had developed into a serious systemic infection that required immediate and sophisticated treatment using only resources available in her wilderness pharmacy. Drawing on both her medical training and her accumulated knowledge of local medicinal plants, Lily May had successfully treated the infection using a combination of traditional remedies and modern medical principles applied with improvised equipment. The experience had proven to her that she had not only survived her exile from civilization, but had developed capabilities that exceeded what she had possessed as a practicing physician with access to modern medical facilities. The psychological healing that had occurred alongside her development of survival skills had been less obvious but equally significant, involving the gradual rebuilding of trust in her own perceptions and judgment that had been systematically undermined during her relationship with Richard. Months of making decisions based on direct observation and immediate feedback had restored her confidence in her ability to assess situations accurately and respond appropriately. The absence of social pressures and expectations had allowed Lily May to rediscover aspects of her personality that had been suppressed or altered during her years of professional advancement and romantic relationship. She had remembered her childhood love of artistic expression, spending hours creating detailed drawings of canyon wildlife and plant formations that combined scientific accuracy with aesthetic beauty. She had rediscovered her enjoyment of physical challenges, taking pleasure in the strength and endurance she had developed through daily climbing and manual labor. Most importantly, she had rebuilt her sense of identity around internal values and personal interests, rather than external validation and social approval. The woman who had once measured her worth by professional achievements and other people's opinions had learned to find satisfaction in simple accomplishments that served her immediate needs and long-term survival goals. The isolation that had initially seemed like a desperate escape from unbearable circumstances had gradually transformed into a chosen lifestyle that provided exactly the kind of healing and growth that Lily May needed. The canyon had become not just a refuge from Richard's influence, but a classroom where she could learn to trust herself again and develop the kind of inner strength that would make her immune to future manipulation. As her second year in the canyon progressed, Lily May had begun to understand that her time in the wilderness was not permanent exile but preparation for eventual reintegration with human society on terms that she would control. The skills she had developed, the confidence she had rebuilt, and the clarity she had gained about her own values and priorities would enable her to create relationships and pursue professional goals that honored her authentic self rather than conforming to other people's expectations. The woman who had fled Tulsa in desperation and terror had been transformed through months of solitude and self-reliance into someone who possessed both the practical skills necessary for independent survival and the psychological strength necessary for healthy human relationships. The cave that had initially provided protection from external threats had become a sanctuary where internal healing could occur without interference or pressure from well-meaning but potentially harmful outside influences. When David Redwing had first appeared in the canyon below her cave, Lily May's immediate reaction had been panic about the end of her carefully constructed isolation and the forced return to social interactions that she might not be ready to handle. But his respectful approach and patient willingness to communicate without demanding immediate trust had suggested possibilities that she had not previously considered. The supplies he had left and the conversations they had shared through careful distance had offered Lily May her first opportunity to test her rebuilt confidence and judgment in the context of human relationship without risking the complete exposure and vulnerability that had made her previous relationships so destructive. David's presence had represented not a threat to her hard-won independence but a chance to practice the social skills she would eventually need for full reintegration with society. The storm that had brought them together in crisis and cooperation had marked the beginning of a new phase in Lily May's recovery, one that would involve learning to trust another person's judgment and assistance, while maintaining the autonomy and self-reliance that had become essential components of her identity. The canyon that had protected her during her most vulnerable period was about to become the setting for her cautious return to human community. The morning David Redwing climbed down from his position on the canyon rim to stand directly beneath Lily May's cave marked the first time in 23 months that she had been within 50 feet of another human being, and the terror that flooded her nervous system was so intense that she had to grip the rock walls to prevent herself from collapsing. David had announced his intention to approach more closely during their previous conversation, explaining that he needed to assess storm damage to the cliff face and wanted to provide hands-on assistance with repairs that would be impossible to coordinate from a distance. Lily May had agreed intellectually, understanding that her cave's structural integrity required evaluation by someone with engineering expertise, but her emotional reaction to his physical proximity revealed how much healing she still needed. Before she could function comfortably in social situations, the panic attack that overwhelmed her as David's voice became clear and distinct, rather than distant and muffled, had triggered responses that she recognized from her medical training, but had never experienced personally. Her heart rate had accelerated to dangerous levels, her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and her vision had tunneled in ways that made it difficult to assess her surroundings or make rational decisions about her safety. David's response to her obvious distress had demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and cultural sensitivity that surprised Lily May with its sophistication. Instead of trying to calm her with reassurances or suggestions that she was overreacting, he had begun speaking in Choctaw, using traditional songs and stories that created a rhythmic, non-threatening background sound that gradually helped her regulate her breathing and heart rate. The traditional healing songs that David shared had been passed down through generations of tribal healers who understood the connection between sound, rhythm, and nervous system regulation. The melodies and cadences had been designed specifically to help traumatized individuals return to emotional balance without requiring verbal interaction or conscious effort, allowing Lily May to recover from her panic attack while maintaining her dignity and sense of control. As her physiological responses gradually returned to normal ranges, Lily May had been able to focus on David's words and understand that he was sharing stories about his own experiences with healing from trauma, not as a way of minimizing her difficulties, but as a demonstration that recovery was possible and that she was not alone in struggling with the aftermath of psychological injury. David's personal stories had revealed that his calm, confident demeanor masked his own history of dealing with significant trauma related to his military service before returning to Oklahoma to take on tribal leadership responsibilities. His tour in Afghanistan had left him with combat-related stress that had required years of traditional healing practices combined with modern therapeutic approaches before he had been able to function effectively in community leadership roles. The parallel experiences had created an unexpected foundation for trust that went beyond David's practical assistance with survival challenges. Lily May had recognized in his voice and manner the hard-won wisdom that came from successfully navigating the long process of healing from psychological wounds that could not be seen or easily understood by people who had never experienced similar trauma. The conversation that followed had been the first honest discussion about trauma recovery that Lily May had ever had with another person, covering topics that she had been unable to address, even with professional therapists who lacked direct experience with the kind of systematic psychological destruction that she had endured. David's understanding of how manipulation and control could shatter someone's ability to trust their own perceptions had come from both his cultural knowledge and his personal experience with authority figures who had abused their power. David had explained that traditional Choctaw healing practices recognized the interconnection between individual trauma and community wellness, understanding that people who had been psychologically damaged by abusive relationships needed to rebuild their sense of self within the context of healthy social connections rather than through continued isolation. The healing process required both personal work and community support, individual strength and collective wisdom. The practical collaboration that began that day had provided Lily May with her first opportunity to test her rebuilt confidence and judgment in the context of working partnership with another person. David's approach to the cliff stabilization project had been to present her with technical information and ask for her input on solutions, rather than making decisions for her or assuming that his expertise should override her intimate knowledge of the cave system. Working together to engineer solutions for the storm damage had required constant communication, shared problem solving, and mutual trust that gradually expanded Lily May's comfort zone without overwhelming her with social demands that she was not ready to handle. Each successful collaboration had built confidence in her ability to maintain her autonomy while benefiting from partnership with someone whose skills and knowledge complemented her own. The engineering challenges had been complex enough to require both David's formal training and Lily May's practical experience with the specific site conditions, creating a partnership dynamic where both individuals brought essential expertise to the problem-solving process. Neither could have achieved optimal results working alone, but together they were able to develop solutions that improved the cave's safety and functionality. Beyond what either had originally envisioned, David's teaching style had incorporated traditional indigenous educational methods that emphasized learning through direct experience and observation rather than abstract instruction or theoretical explanation. He had demonstrated techniques for working with stone and natural materials, then stepped back to allow Lily May to practice and develop her own approaches rather than insisting that she replicate his methods exactly. The cultural knowledge that David shared during their work sessions had provided Lily May with frameworks for understanding her own experience that were more helpful than the psychological theories she had learned in medical school or encountered in therapy. Traditional concepts about the relationship between individual wellness and community harmony had given her new ways of thinking about her isolation and recovery that honored both her need for independence and her eventual desire for human connection. Most significantly, David had introduced Lily May to traditional Choctaw teachings about the difference between solitude that heals and isolation that harms, helping her understand that her time in the canyon had been a necessary period of spiritual and psychological recovery rather than evidence of weakness or failure. The indigenous perspective on trauma recovery emphasized that some wounds required withdrawal from harmful social environments before healthy relationships could be rebuilt. The gradual expansion of their working relationship had included David's sharing of traditional plant knowledge that complemented Lily May's medical understanding of nutrition and natural remedies. His expertise in identifying and preparing medicinal plants using methods developed over generations had enhanced her already impressive wilderness pharmacy while teaching her about the cultural contexts that made traditional healing practices most effective. The plant-gathering expeditions that they began taking together had provided structured activities that allowed for natural conversation while focusing on practical tasks that served Lily May's immediate survival needs. The shared work had created opportunities for relationship building that felt safe and purposeful, rather than artificially social or emotionally demanding. David's approach to sharing traditional ecological knowledge had been careful to respect both Lily May's scientific background and the cultural protocols that governed the transmission of sacred information to non-tribal members. He had explained which practices could be shared freely and which required specific cultural preparation, helping Lily May understand the difference between practical techniques and spiritual practices that carry deeper cultural significance. The seasonal round of activities that David introduced had provided Lily May with a more sophisticated understanding of how indigenous peoples had historically managed their relationship with the natural environment, combining practical sustainability with spiritual practices that maintained balance between human needs and ecological health. The traditional calendar had offered her a framework for planning her activities that was more closely aligned with natural cycles than the artificial schedules that had dominated her previous life. The breakthrough in their relationship had come during a difficult conversation about Lily May's eventual plans for leaving the canyon and returning to some form of participation in mainstream society. David had asked careful questions about her professional background and the circumstances that had led to her isolation, not from curiosity, but from a genuine desire to understand what kind of support she would need for successful reintegration. Lily May's decision to share the full story of her relationship with Richard and her flight from her medical career had been the first time she had spoken those experiences aloud, and the telling had been both terrifying and liberating. David's responses had demonstrated understanding without pity, anger at Richard's behavior without judgment of Lily May's choices, and confidence in her strength without minimizing the challenges she had faced. The conversation had revealed that David's interest in helping her was not just humanitarian concern for someone in crisis, but recognition of her potential contributions to communities that needed medical expertise combined with cultural sensitivity. His vision for her future had included possibilities that she had not considered, ways of using her professional skills that would honor both her need for autonomy and her desire to serve underserved populations. David had explained that tribal health services throughout Oklahoma faced chronic shortages of medical professionals who understood indigenous communities and could work effectively within traditional healing frameworks. Lily May's combination of medical expertise, wilderness survival skills, and growing understanding of traditional healing practices made her uniquely qualified for roles that few other physicians could fill. The suggestion that her time in the canyon had actually prepared her for specialized work that she could not have done as a conventional hospital physician had reframed Lily May's entire understanding of her isolation. Instead of seeing her wilderness years as time lost from her medical career, she began to understand them as intensive training for a different kind of medical practice that could serve communities in ways that mainstream healthcare systems often failed to address. The practical planning that began to emerge from these conversations had focused on gradual transitions that would allow Lily May to maintain her psychological gains while slowly expanding her social interactions and professional activities. David had suggested starting with medical consultation work that could be done remotely, then gradually moving toward direct patient care as her comfort with human interaction continued to develop. The partnership approach that David had consistently maintained throughout their relationship had extended to planning for Lily May's future, with him serving as an advisor and cultural bridge rather than a decision-maker who would determine her path. His role had been to provide information about opportunities and resources while ensuring that all choices remained entirely under her control. The trust that had developed between them had been built through consistent demonstration of respect for Lily May's autonomy and judgment, rather than through emotional appeals or promises about future relationships. David had proven his trustworthiness through actions rather than words, showing that he could be relied upon for practical support without demanding personal information or emotional intimacy that Lily May was not ready to provide. The healing that had occurred through their partnership had been different from the solitary recovery that Lily May had achieved during her first months in the canyon, involving the rebuilding of her capacity for healthy human relationships rather than just the development of individual strength and self-reliance. Working with David had taught her that she could maintain her hard-won independence while benefiting from collaboration with someone who respected her boundaries and supported her goals. The transformation that had taken place over months of careful relationship building had prepared Lily May for the next phase of her recovery, which would involve gradually expanding her social circle and beginning to consider how she might use her rebuilt strength and confidence to contribute to communities that needed her particular combination of skills and experience. The canyon that had protected her during her most vulnerable period was about to become the launching point for her return to purposeful engagement with the world. As autumn approached and the time for difficult decisions about her future drew near, Lily May had found herself looking forward to conversations with David rather than dreading human contact, seeking his advice on complex problems rather than avoiding all outside input, and beginning to envision possibilities for her life that extended beyond simple survival to include meaningful work and healthy relationships. The woman who had climbed into the canyon cave as a terrified refugee from psychological abuse had been transformed through months of solitude and gradual relationship building into someone who possessed both the practical skills necessary for independent living and the emotional strength necessary for healthy human connections. The test of that transformation would come as she began to consider leaving the safety of her canyon sanctuary for the challenges and opportunities of a wider world that she was finally ready to engage on her own terms. The phone call that would shatter Lily May's carefully constructed sanctuary came on a crisp October morning when she was grinding acorns for winter flour. The satellite phone that David had insisted she carry crackling to life with news that would force her to confront the world she had fled 2.5 years earlier. Detective Maria Santos from the Tulsa Police Department had been searching for Dr. Lily May Harrison for 8 months, following leads in a case that had grown from a simple missing person report into a complex investigation involving medical fraud, insurance schemes, and what appeared to be a pattern of psychological abuse that had affected multiple women in Oklahoma's medical community. Richard Blackwood had been arrested 6 weeks earlier on charges that included identity theft, insurance fraud, and practicing medicine without proper licensing in cases where he had forged Lily May's signature on patient documents and insurance claims. The investigation had revealed that Richard's medical credentials were fraudulent, that he had never completed a legitimate neurosurgical residency, and that his entire professional identity had been constructed through document forgery and institutional manipulation. More disturbing were the discoveries about Richard's personal relationships with at least 4 other professional women over the past decade, each following a pattern of psychological manipulation, professional sabotage, and financial exploitation that had left his victims emotionally and professionally destroyed. 2 of the women had attempted suicide. One had been institutionalized for psychological treatment, and another had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only scattered evidence of systematic abuse. Detective Santos explained that Lily May's testimony would be crucial for establishing the pattern of behavior that prosecutors needed to secure convictions on the most serious charges, particularly those related to the psychological abuse that had driven multiple victims to abandon their careers and personal relationships. Without victim testimony, Richard's skilled legal team would likely succeed in reducing the charges to simple fraud cases that carried minimal prison sentences. The revelation that Richard had never been a legitimate physician, that his surgical consultations had been elaborate performances designed to establish credibility, while he gradually gained control over vulnerable professional women, had triggered a psychological crisis that sent Lily May into a dissociative state where she could barely process the implications of what she was learning. David had found her sitting motionless at the cave entrance 3 hours after the phone call ended, staring at the canyon walls as if seeing them for the first time, unable to speak or respond to questions about her immediate needs or safety. The psychological shock of learning that her entire relationship with Richard had been based on lies, even more fundamental than she had realized, had temporarily shattered the identity and confidence she had rebuilt through years of wilderness survival. The traditional healing ceremony that David organized in response to Lily May's crisis had drawn on Choctaw practices for helping community members recover from spiritual wounds that could not be addressed through conventional medical treatment. The ceremony had required permission from tribal elders and the participation of traditional healers who understood the specific protocols for addressing trauma that had been inflicted through deception and betrayal. The healing process had involved 4 days of traditional cleansing practices, plant medicine prepared according to ancient recipes, and storytelling that connected Lily May's experience to historical examples of community members who had survived deliberate attempts to destroy their identity and purpose. The ceremony had not been about forgetting or minimizing her trauma, but about placing it within a cultural framework that honored her survival and recognized her strength. During the ceremony, Lily May had learned that traditional Choctaw justice systems had historically dealt with individuals who used deception and manipulation to harm community members, through practices that focused on restoring balance rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. The concept of restorative justice had provided her with a framework for understanding her role in Richard's prosecution that emphasized healing for all affected parties rather than revenge or punishment. The spiritual cleansing had been accompanied by practical planning sessions, where tribal legal advocates had helped Lily May understand her rights as a victim and a witness, the protections available to her during the legal process, and the support systems that would be necessary for her to participate in prosecution without re-traumatizing herself or compromising the psychological gains she had achieved through years of recovery. Most importantly, the traditional healers had helped Lily May understand that her decision to participate in Richard's prosecution could be viewed as a form of community service that would protect other potential victims while contributing to the restoration of justice and balance that his crimes had disrupted. Her testimony would serve not just the legal system, but the broader community of women who had been or might be targeted by similar predators. The decision to leave the canyon and return to Oklahoma society had been made not from external pressure, but from Lily May's growing understanding that her healing journey required her to reclaim her professional identity and use her experience to help others who had faced similar trauma. The canyon had provided the sanctuary she needed for initial recovery, but true healing would require her to transform her survival into service. The transition plan that David developed in consultation with tribal social services and victim advocacy organizations had been designed to minimize the psychological risks associated with Lily May's return to social interaction while maximizing her ability to contribute meaningfully to the prosecution and to her own continued healing. The plan had included safe housing, professional counseling, legal representation, and gradual reintegration into medical practice. The tribal health clinic in Choctaw had offered Lily May a position that would allow her to use her medical expertise, while working within a supportive community structure that understood trauma recovery and respected her need for professional autonomy. The position had been specifically created to serve rural communities where her combination of traditional and modern medical knowledge would be most valuable. The preparation for leaving the canyon had involved weeks of careful planning and emotional work that addressed Lily May's fears about returning to a world where Richard's influence might still pose a threat to her safety and psychological stability. David had arranged for security measures that would protect her during the legal proceedings, while ensuring that she maintained control over her living situation and professional activities. The testimony that Lily May eventually provided to the grand jury had been delivered through video conference from a secure location, allowing her to participate in the legal process without the additional stress of traveling to Tulsa or facing Richard in person before she was emotionally prepared for such an encounter. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the systematic nature of Richard's crimes and the devastating impact of his manipulation on multiple victims. The strength that Lily May had demonstrated during her testimony had surprised even her own legal advocates, who had been concerned about her ability to withstand cross-examination that would inevitably focus on her dramatic decision to disappear into the wilderness. Instead, her years of survival experience had provided her with unshakable confidence in her own perceptions and judgment that made her an exceptionally credible witness. The medical license restoration process had required Lily May to undergo extensive evaluation and retraining to ensure that her years away from conventional practice had not compromised her clinical skills. But the evaluations had revealed that her wilderness medical experience had actually enhanced her diagnostic abilities and emergency treatment capabilities beyond what she had possessed as a hospital-based physician. The rural medical practice that Lily May established in partnership with the tribal health system had combined conventional emergency medicine with traditional healing practices in ways that served communities where mainstream healthcare had historically been inadequate or culturally inappropriate. Her unique background had enabled her to bridge cultural gaps that had prevented many indigenous patients from accessing effective medical care. The success of her integrated medical practice had attracted attention from healthcare policy researchers, who were studying innovative approaches to serving underserved rural populations, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that established Lily May as a recognized expert in culturally sensitive emergency medicine and trauma-informed healthcare delivery. The relationship with David had evolved naturally, from mentorship and professional collaboration into a personal partnership based on shared values, complementary skills, and mutual respect for each other's independence and cultural identity. Their relationship had provided Lily May with her first experience of romantic partnership between equals who supported each other's growth rather than competing for control. The wedding ceremony had incorporated both traditional Choctaw elements and medical community traditions, celebrating not just their personal commitment, but the success of a healing journey that had transformed individual trauma into community service and cultural bridge building. The ceremony had been attended by trauma survivors, medical colleagues, tribal elders, and legal advocates who had supported various aspects of Lily May's recovery and reintegration. The victim impact statement that Lily May delivered at Richard's sentencing had been broadcast live to medical communities throughout Oklahoma and Texas, serving as both a warning about predatory behavior in professional settings and a powerful example of how survivors could reclaim their lives and careers. After systematic psychological abuse, Richard had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on multiple felony charges. The foundation that Lily May and David established to support other professional women who had experienced workplace abuse had grown into a nationally recognized organization that provided legal advocacy, psychological support, and career rehabilitation services to victims of professional manipulation and fraud. The Foundation's work had led to policy changes in medical licensing and institutional oversight that made it more difficult for predators to exploit professional relationships. The medical school lectureships that Lily May began delivering focused on recognizing and responding to psychological manipulation in professional settings, teaching future physicians to identify warning signs of abusive behavior and providing them with tools for supporting colleagues who might be experiencing professional or personal trauma. Her wilderness survival experience had become a powerful metaphor for the kind of self-reliance and inner strength that medical professionals needed to maintain their integrity under pressure. The children's book that Lily May wrote about her Canyon experience had been designed to help young people understand that temporary withdrawal from harmful situations could be a sign of strength rather than weakness, and that healing sometimes required time away from normal social expectations before healthy relationships could be rebuilt. The book had become a resource for counselors working with children who had experienced various forms of trauma. The documentary film about Lily May's case and recovery had been produced in collaboration with tribal media organizations, had won awards for its sensitive portrayal of both trauma recovery and indigenous healing practices. The film had been used in medical schools and law enforcement training programs to illustrate the complex dynamics of psychological abuse and the importance of culturally appropriate support systems for survivors. The annual survival skills workshops that Lily May and David conducted for healthcare professionals had grown into week-long intensive programs that combined wilderness education with trauma recovery techniques, teaching participants practical skills for emergency situations while providing them with experiential understanding of resilience, adaptation, and self-reliance that enhanced their ability to serve patients who had faced extreme challenges. The research collaboration with the University of Oklahoma Medical School had focused on developing protocols for treating patients who had experienced systematic psychological abuse, drawing on both Lily May's clinical experience and traditional indigenous healing practices to create more effective approaches to trauma recovery that honored both individual autonomy and community support systems. The advocacy work that had emerged from Lily May's legal case had contributed to significant reforms in how professional licensing boards investigated complaints related to psychological abuse and manipulation, creating new categories of professional misconduct that addressed the subtle but devastating tactics that predators used to control and exploit their victims while maintaining professional credibility. The transformation that had begun with a terrified woman climbing into a canyon cave had rippled outward to affect thousands of people through changed policies, educational programs, healing services, and cultural bridge building that connected traditional indigenous wisdom with modern professional practice. Lily May's journey from victim to survivor to healer had become a model for how individual recovery could serve broader community healing and social justice. The annual return visits to the Canyon Cave had become a family tradition that included David, their 2 children, and often groups of medical students or trauma survivors who were participating in their educational programs. The cave that had once provided desperate refuge had been transformed into a classroom where people could learn about resilience, traditional healing, and the complex relationships between individual trauma and community wellness. The legacy that Lily May and David were building through their work had created permanent changes in how medical communities, legal systems, and healing professions address the intersection of professional abuse and personal trauma, ensuring that future victims would have access to support systems and legal protections that had not been available during Lily May's ordeal. Their partnership had proven that healing from severe trauma was not only possible but could become the foundation for transformative service to others. 25 years after Lily May Harrison first disappeared into the Red Canyon walls of southeastern Oklahoma, the cave that had once sheltered a terrified woman fleeing psychological destruction had become a pilgrimage site for trauma survivors, medical professionals, and indigenous healers from around the world who came to understand how ancient wisdom could transform modern suffering into healing power. The Harrison Redwing Institute for Integrated Healing had grown from a small tribal health clinic into an internationally recognized center for trauma recovery that combined cutting-edge medical research with traditional indigenous healing practices, serving as a model for culturally sensitive healthcare that had been replicated in communities across North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Dr. Lily Mae Harrison Redwing, now 59 years old, stood at the entrance to her former cave sanctuary with her granddaughter Helena, age 12, who was participating in the family's annual pilgrimage to honor the place where her grandmother's transformation had begun, and to learn the stories that connected their family's history to the larger narrative of healing and justice that continued to unfold. Helena possessed her grandmother's scientific curiosity and her grandfather's deep connection to traditional Choctaw culture, representing a new generation that seamlessly integrated ancient wisdom with modern knowledge in ways that created possibilities neither tradition could achieve alone. She was already showing interest in both medicine and environmental science, asking questions about plant pharmacology and ecological relationships that impressed the university researchers who visited their programs. The International Conference on Trauma-Informed Indigenous Healthcare that was being held at the Institute that week had attracted over 800 participants from 6 continents, including physicians, social workers, traditional healers, legal advocates, and policymakers who were working to create more effective responses to systematic abuse and community trauma in their own cultural contexts. The cave itself had been carefully preserved as a historic site while being equipped with modern safety features that allowed for educational visits without compromising the natural environment that had made survival possible during Lily Mae's years of isolation. Solar-powered lighting, emergency communication systems, and weather monitoring equipment had been installed using techniques that minimized visual impact while ensuring visitor safety. The storytelling that took place in the cave during educational programs had become one of the Institute's most powerful teaching tools, allowing participants to experience firsthand the environment where individual healing had occurred while learning about the cultural and psychological principles that had made transformation possible. The stories were told by Lily Mae herself, by other trauma survivors who had benefited from her programs, and by traditional healers who placed personal recovery within larger contexts of community wellness. The research laboratory that had been built into the canyon walls using traditional indigenous architecture had become a leading center for studying the neurobiological effects of trauma and the mechanisms through which cultural healing practices created measurable changes in brain function and stress response systems. The research had provided scientific validation for traditional healing methods while identifying ways to enhance their effectiveness through integration with modern therapeutic approaches. The pharmaceutical research program that Lily Mae had established in partnership with major universities had focused on developing new medications from plants that she had used for healing during her canyon years, creating a sustainable economic model that provided royalties to tribal communities while respecting traditional knowledge and cultural protocols. 3 new drugs for treating anxiety and depression had been developed from her ethnobotanical research. The legal advocacy program that had grown from Lily Mae's own case had successfully prosecuted over 200 cases of professional abuse and manipulation, leading to permanent policy changes in medical licensing, academic institutions, and corporate environments that made it significantly more difficult for predators to exploit professional relationships. The program had trained over 5,000 advocates who worked in communities throughout North America. The children and adolescents who participated in the Institute's youth programs had consistently shown remarkable improvements in academic performance, emotional regulation, and social relationships after completing wilderness survival courses that combined practical skills, training with traditional healing practices and modern psychological support. Many had gone on to pursue careers in healthcare, law enforcement, and social services. The documentary film series that had been produced about the Institute's work had won multiple international awards and had been translated into over 30 languages, reaching audiences worldwide with messages about the possibility of healing from severe trauma and the importance of culturally appropriate support systems for survivors of systematic abuse. The films have been used in educational programs from elementary schools to graduate medical programs. The policy research that had emerged from the Institute's work had influenced legislation in 12 states and 3 Canadian provinces, creating new categories of criminal offense for psychological manipulation and systematic abuse while establishing funding streams for culturally sensitive victim services and alternative healing programs. The research had been cited in over 300 academic papers and policy documents. The traditional plant preservation program that Lily May and David had established had created seed banks and cultivation sites for over 200 medicinal plants that were disappearing from their natural habitats due to climate change and development pressure. The program had partnered with indigenous communities throughout the Americas to preserve traditional ecological knowledge while adapting cultivation practices to changing environmental conditions. The International Fellowship Program had brought over 1,500 healthcare professionals from around the world to study at the Institute, creating a global network of practitioners who had been trained in trauma-informed care that integrated traditional and modern healing approaches. Many fellows had established similar programs in their home countries, creating a worldwide movement toward more culturally sensitive and effective trauma treatment. The memoir that Lily May had published on the 20th anniversary of leaving the Canyon had become a best-selling book that had been assigned reading in medical schools, law schools, and psychology programs throughout North America. The book had been particularly influential in changing how professional education programs address the risks of workplace abuse and the importance of maintaining personal boundaries in high-pressure environments. The speaking engagements that Lily May conducted at medical conferences, legal symposiums, and indigenous healing gatherings had reached over 50,000 people directly, with recordings and broadcasts extending her influence to millions more who had learned about the connections between individual trauma recovery and broader social justice work. Her presentations had been credited with inspiring numerous other survivors to come forward and seek help. The mentorship program that paired trauma survivors with healthcare professionals who had completed the Institute's training had created over 3,000 successful partnerships that had resulted in significant improvements in both personal healing outcomes and professional effectiveness for participants. The program had become a model for peer support that had been replicated in hundreds of communities. The annual gathering of survivors, healers, and advocates that took place at the Institute each autumn had grown into a week-long celebration that combined traditional ceremonies, academic presentations, policy workshops, and cultural exchanges that strengthened the global network of people working to transform trauma into healing power. The gathering had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking both personal healing and professional development. The canyon ecosystem had been enhanced through the Institute's environmental restoration programs that had reintroduced native plant species, improved water quality, and created habitat for wildlife populations that had been displaced by development in surrounding areas. The restoration work had been guided by traditional ecological knowledge while incorporating modern conservation science and climate adaptation strategies. The scholarship program that provided free education and training for indigenous youth interested in healthcare careers had graduated over 800 students who had gone on to serve their communities as physicians, nurses, social workers, traditional healers, and health policy advocates. The program had been particularly successful in training bilingual providers who could work effectively across cultural boundaries. The prison outreach program that provided trauma recovery services to incarcerated individuals had demonstrated remarkable success in reducing recidivism rates, while helping participants address the underlying trauma that had contributed to their involvement in criminal activity. The program had been expanded to over 40 correctional facilities and had influenced policy changes in criminal justice approaches to trauma-informed rehabilitation. The corporate consultation services that the Institute provided had helped dozens of major employers develop workplace policies and training programs that prevented professional abuse, while creating more supportive environments for employees who had experienced trauma. The consultation work had generated revenue that supported the Institute's charitable programs, while extending their influence into business and government sectors. The climate change adaptation research that had been integrated into the Institute's programs had focused on helping communities develop resilience to environmental disasters, while maintaining cultural practices and healing traditions that provided psychological support during periods of disruption and displacement. The research had been particularly relevant for indigenous communities facing forced relocation due to rising sea levels and extreme weather events. The technology platforms that had been developed to deliver trauma-informed care remotely had made the Institute's services accessible to isolated communities worldwide. Using secure video conferencing, mobile applications, and online training modules that maintained the personal connection and cultural sensitivity that were essential components of effective healing work. The platforms had been used by over 100,000 people in remote areas. The grandchildren who played in the canyon during family gatherings had grown up understanding that their family story was part of a larger narrative about the human capacity for transformation and the responsibility that came with having experienced healing to share that healing with others. They had been raised to understand both the privileges and obligations that came from being part of a family that had turned personal trauma into community service. The legacy that Lily Mae and David had created through their partnership had demonstrated that the most profound healing often occurred when individual recovery was connected to broader social justice work and community service, proving that trauma survivors could become powerful agents of positive change when they were provided with appropriate support and opportunities to transform their experience into wisdom that could benefit others. The international recognition that the Institute had received had included honorary degrees from 12 universities, humanitarian awards from 4 countries, and designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its preservation of traditional healing knowledge and its innovative integration of indigenous wisdom with modern healthcare approaches. The recognition had brought additional resources and credibility that enhanced the Institute's ability to serve communities worldwide. The partnership agreements that had been established with major medical centers, universities, and government agencies had created sustainable funding streams that ensured the Institute's programs would continue to grow and evolve long after Lily Mae and David were no longer directly involved in daily operations. The partnerships had also created career pathways for indigenous healthcare professionals and trauma survivors who wanted to contribute to the healing movement. The cave that had once hidden a woman too broken to trust another human being had become a symbol of hope for trauma survivors worldwide, demonstrating that even the most severe psychological injuries could be healed when individuals had access to appropriate support, cultural wisdom, and opportunities to transform their pain into service to others. The transformation had proven that healing was not just possible, but could become the foundation for creating positive change that extended far beyond individual recovery. As Lily Mae and Helena stood together at the cave entrance, watching the sun set over the Red Canyon walls that had witnessed so much transformation, they represented the continuation of a healing tradition that connected ancient wisdom with modern knowledge, individual recovery with community service, and personal trauma with social justice work that would continue to benefit countless people for generations to come. The woman who had once crawled into this cave like a frightened animal had become a healer whose influence extended around the world. proving that the human capacity for transformation exceeded even the human capacity for destruction, and that love, wisdom, and community support could overcome even the most systematic attempts to break the human spirit. The cave had become not an ending but a beginning, not a place of hiding but a foundation for healing that would continue to grow and spread, as long as there were people who needed hope and communities willing to provide the support that made recovery possible. The story that had begun with one woman's desperate flight from psychological abuse had become a movement that changed laws, transformed institutions, influenced medical practice, and most importantly, proved to thousands of trauma survivors that healing was possible and that their experience could become a source of strength, not just for themselves, but for entire communities of people who needed to believe that recovery was achievable and that their lives had value and purpose that extended beyond their trauma. The morning ritual that Lily Mae maintained, even at 59, involved climbing to the highest point in the canyon system to watch the sunrise paint the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson, a practice that connected her daily to the spiritual transformation that had begun in this place and continued to unfold through her work around the world. The meditation time provided her with the centered energy necessary for leading an organization that served thousands of people while maintaining the personal authenticity that made her teaching and healing work effective. The letters that arrived daily from trauma survivors around the world had created a correspondence network that spanned continents and cultures, with people sharing their own stories of recovery and transformation while seeking guidance for challenges that required both practical advice and spiritual support. Lily Mae personally responded to over 50 letters each week, viewing this communication as an essential component of her healing mission rather than an administrative burden. The virtual reality training programs that the Institute had developed allowed healthcare providers to experience simulated trauma scenarios that taught them to recognize subtle signs of psychological abuse and manipulation that might otherwise be missed during routine patient interactions. The programs had been adopted by medical schools in 23 countries and had significantly improved early intervention rates for victims of systematic abuse. The wilderness therapy expeditions that took place throughout the year had evolved into sophisticated programs that combine survival skills training with intensive psychological support and traditional healing practices, serving everyone from combat veterans to trafficking survivors to executives recovering from workplace abuse. The expeditions had maintained waiting lists of over 2 years due to their remarkable success rates and word-of-mouth recommendations. The botanical garden that had been established adjacent to the Institute featured over 800 medicinal plants from indigenous traditions worldwide, creating a living laboratory where researchers could study plant pharmacology, while traditional healers could teach ethnobotanical knowledge to students who would carry this wisdom into modern medical practice. The garden had become a destination for botanical researchers and traditional healers who collaborated on projects that bridged ancient wisdom with contemporary science. The publishing program that had grown from Lily Mae's memoir had produced over 40 books by trauma survivors, traditional healers, and healthcare professionals who had been trained at the Institute, creating a library of resources that provided both practical guidance and inspirational examples for people at various stages of recovery. The publishing program had donated over 1 million books to schools, libraries, and community organizations worldwide. The architectural innovations that had been developed for the Institute's buildings had created structures that combined traditional indigenous design principles with modern sustainability technologies, resulting in healing environments that supported psychological recovery while demonstrating harmony between human needs and natural systems. The designs had been replicated in healthcare facilities throughout North America and had influenced green building standards in several states. The economic development programs that had been created in partnership with tribal communities had generated over $50 million in sustainable revenue through ethical pharmaceutical development, ecotourism, traditional craft production, and organic agriculture initiatives that honored cultural values while providing economic opportunities for indigenous families. The programs had become models for culturally appropriate economic development that have been studied by development agencies worldwide. The disaster response protocols that have been developed based on the Institute's trauma-informed care principles have been deployed in response to natural disasters, mass violence events, and community crises in over 30 locations, providing immediate psychological support while laying foundations for long-term community healing and resilience building. The protocols have been adopted by emergency management agencies and humanitarian organizations internationally. The medical school curriculum reforms that had been influenced by the Institute's research had required all students to complete training in recognizing and responding to trauma, cultural competency in healthcare delivery, and integration of traditional healing approaches with modern medical practice. The curriculum changes had been implemented in over 100 medical schools and had significantly improved healthcare outcomes for marginalized populations. The artificial intelligence research project that had been developed to identify patterns of systematic abuse in healthcare settings had created algorithms that could detect subtle indicators of professional manipulation and predatory behavior that human observers might miss. The technology had been implemented in hospital systems and medical practices to provide early warning systems that could prevent abuse before it escalated to dangerous levels. The international treaty negotiations that Lily May had participated in had led to the adoption of new protocols for protecting traditional healing knowledge while ensuring that indigenous communities received fair compensation for pharmaceutical developments based on their ancestral wisdom. The treaties had been ratified by 18 countries and had created legal frameworks that balanced cultural preservation with scientific advancement. The climate refugee assistance programs that had been established recognized that environmental displacement often created psychological trauma that required specialized treatment approaches, combining practical relocation support with culturally appropriate healing services. The programs had served over 10,000 people who had been forced to leave their ancestral lands due to climate change impacts. The therapeutic horse program that had been integrated into the Institute's services had demonstrated remarkable effectiveness in helping trauma survivors rebuild trust in relationships while developing emotional regulation skills through interaction with animals that provided unconditional acceptance and honest feedback. The program had been replicated at over 200 facilities and had helped thousands of people develop confidence in their ability to form healthy relationships. The neuroscience research collaborations that had been established with major universities had produced groundbreaking discoveries about how traditional healing practices created measurable changes in brain structure and function, providing scientific validation for approaches that had been dismissed by mainstream medicine, while identifying mechanisms that could enhance therapeutic effectiveness. The research had been published in over 100 peer-reviewed journals and had changed how medical professionals understood the relationship between culture and healing. The family therapy programs that had been developed specifically for families affected by professional abuse had addressed the complex dynamics that occurred when systematic manipulation had damaged not just primary victims, but their children, parents, siblings, and friends who had been secondary victims of the abuser's strategies. The programs had helped thousands of families rebuild trust and communication while developing strategies for preventing future victimization. The online support communities that had been created for trauma survivors had grown into networks, serving over 50,000 people worldwide, providing 24-hour peer support, professional consultation, and educational resources in dozens of languages. The communities had become self-sustaining ecosystems of mutual support that continued to grow and evolve as participants moved through different stages of recovery. The policy advocacy work that had emerged from the Institute's research had influenced legislation addressing workplace harassment, professional licensing standards, victim protection services, and funding for alternative healing approaches in healthcare systems. The advocacy had resulted in policy changes that had improved protections and services for millions of people, while establishing legal precedents that would benefit future generations. The cultural exchange programs that brought traditional healers from indigenous communities worldwide to share knowledge and learn from each other had created unprecedented collaborations that preserved ancient wisdom while developing new approaches to contemporary healing challenges. The exchanges had resulted in innovative therapeutic techniques that combined multiple traditional approaches with modern psychological understanding.